Welcome back. Today, May 6, 2026, the war between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran has entered the most dangerous phase since the opening strikes 67 days ago. What is unfolding right now in real time across the diplomatic corridors of Beijing, Islamabad, and Washington is not a negotiation. It is a collision of desperation. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, landed in Beijing this morning to meet Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the first face-to-face meeting between the top diplomats of the two allies since the war began. China publicly demanded an immediate end to hostilities and the prompt resumption of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's own readout of the meeting notably omitted that demand. Hours earlier, Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared that Operation Epic Fury, the U.S.-Israeli air campaign that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and devastated Iran's military infrastructure, is over. In the same breath, he said the U.S. priority is now reopening the strait. And then, in a move that stunned military analysts and drew immediate mockery from Iranian state media, President Donald Trump announced that he was pausing Project Freedom, the two-day-old naval operation to guide stranded ships through the Strait of Hormuz, citing great progress toward a deal that, by every credible account, does not exist. Iran's state news agency INSA said Trump paused the operation following firm positions and warnings from Iran. Tasnim, linked to the Revolutionary Guards, described it in two words: Trump backs down. What is actually happening behind the diplomatic theater? Why did Iran's president reportedly clash with the IRGC commander over how the war is being conducted? What does it mean that Iran's foreign ministry says there are no nuclear negotiations, while the United States insists that zero enrichment is the precondition for any deal? And why has Pakistan, not Russia, not China, not any member of the UN Security Council, become the only nation capable of keeping this ceasefire from collapsing entirely? Stay with us, because the answers reveal a war that has reached the point where neither side can win, neither side can afford to lose. And every path forward leads through a minefield of contradictions that no diplomat on earth knows how to navigate. If you want raw analysis that cuts through the press conferences and shows you what is actually happening behind the curtain, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us get into it. The critical phase began on April 8th, when Pakistan brokered a conditional two-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran. The agreement was negotiated in a frantic final stretch between Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi. China provided a last-minute nudge that helped secure Iranian Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei's approval, delivered through a written statement read on state television, because Mojtaba has not appeared publicly since the February 28th strike that killed his father and left him severely injured. The ceasefire was supposed to involve the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. It did not. Iran opened the strait on its own terms, charging tolls exceeding $1 million per vessel, controlling transit through IRGC-operated corridors, and allowing passage only to nations it deemed friendly. The United States called this a violation of the agreement. Iran called the U.S. naval blockade, imposed on April 13th after the Islamabad talks failed, the real violation. The Islamabad talks themselves were historic and catastrophic in equal measure. On April 11 and 12, Vice President Vance sat across from Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf in the highest-level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 revolution. 47 years of no direct talks, broken in a meeting room in Pakistan's capital while a fragile ceasefire ticked down and 800 ships sat stranded in the Gulf. The symbolism was enormous. The substance was zero. The gap between the two sides was not a crack. It was a canyon. The United States presented a 15-point plan that demanded Iran's unconditional surrender on its nuclear program, including zero enrichment, the removal of all enriched uranium, including its stockpile of over 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that the U.S. says could be used to make a bomb, the dismantling of underground centrifuge facilities, the end of Iran's ballistic missile program, and the termination of all funding and arming of proxy groups across the region, including Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis. Iran rejected every major demand. Trump had said on March 6th that only Iran's unconditional surrender would be acceptable. The 15-point plan was that demand translated into diplomatic language. Iran's counterproposal was a 10-point plan delivered through Pakistan that included a solution to all regional conflicts, including Lebanon, the lifting of all sanctions, reconstruction assistance for the estimated $200 to $270 billion in infrastructure damage, and a protocol for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but critically deferred the nuclear issue to a later phase of talks. Iran's framework proposed that under this approach, negotiations over the more complicated nuclear issue would be moved to the final stage to create a more conducive atmosphere. The United States rejected the deferral absolutely. Rubio said Iran has always said they do not want a nuclear weapon, but they just do not mean it, accusing Tehran of doing all the things a country does if it wants a nuclear weapons program, including developing long-range delivery missiles and building underground enrichment centrifuges. Iran rejected the preconditions. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has stated flatly that Iran will not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment. Iran's foreign ministry has declared that uranium will under no circumstances be transferred anywhere. The talks ended. Trump said he no longer cared about negotiations and ordered the naval blockade. Since then, the ceasefire has existed in a state of permanent near death. Trump extended it repeatedly, each time claiming progress that neither side could confirm. He set a deadline of March 21st, then March 23rd, then April 7. Each deadline passed without consequence. On April 22nd, U.S. officials said Trump had given Iran 3 to 5 days to engage in negotiations and resolve alleged infighting within the government before resuming attacks. That deadline also passed. On May 3rd, Trump launched Project Freedom, deploying guided missile destroyers, more than 100 aircraft, and 15,000 service members to guide stranded ships through the strait. On the first day, Iran fired cruise missiles, drones, and launched fast attack boats against American-flagged vessels. Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed the attacks, stating U.S. attack helicopters destroyed the boats and intercepted the drones. 2 U.S.-flagged merchant ships made it through. Then on May 5th, Trump paused Project Freedom, citing progress toward a deal. Iran said the pause followed firm positions and warnings. The shipping industry said its risk assessment remained unchanged and transits were not possible. On May 3rd, Iran said it had received the U.S. response to its latest peace proposal. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said there are no nuclear negotiations at this stage, a direct contradiction of Washington's insistence that the nuclear issue must be resolved first. Trump said he would review the Iranian proposal, but could not imagine it would be acceptable because Iran has not yet paid a big enough price for what they have done to humanity and the world over the last 47 years. The internal fractures within the Iranian regime are no longer whispered rumors. They are becoming visible through the cracks. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian reportedly clashed with IRGC Commander-in-Chief Ahmad Vahidi over how the war is being conducted. Pezeshkian warned that without a ceasefire, Iran's economy could collapse within 3 to 4 weeks. He criticized the IRGC's attacks on neighboring countries, specifically the strikes on UAE oil facilities, Saudi infrastructure, and Gulf Cooperation Council civilian targets, and called for the restoration of executive powers to the civilian government. This is not a minor bureaucratic disagreement. It is a fundamental conflict between the civilian president, who sees economic survival as the priority, and the military commander, who controls the Revolutionary Guards, the Strait of Hormuz, and the instruments of war that give Iran its only remaining leverage. The IRGC views the Hormuz closure as the single card that keeps Iran at the negotiating table. Pezeshkian views it as the card that is destroying the economy faster than any American bomb. Both are right, and nobody has the authority to resolve the contradiction. The nuclear dimension adds another layer of impossible complexity. Iran informed the International Atomic Energy Agency that normal safeguards were legally untenable and materially impracticable as a result of threats and acts of aggression, leaving the IAEA unable to verify whether Iran had suspended enrichment or confirmed the status of its current stockpile. Analysts in the UK and the US have characterized Iran's strategy as nuclear hedging, developing the technical infrastructure to assemble a weapon on short notice while stopping short of actual production. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists assessed that Iran is using its enrichment program and uranium stockpiles for leverage in international negotiations and is willing to discuss some curbs in exchange for sanctions relief and the prevention of future attacks. But Rubio said that even though Iran has always claimed it does not want a nuclear weapon, it simply does not mean it. The U.S. position is that the enrichment must stop entirely. Iran's position is that enrichment is a sovereign right that will never be surrendered. There is no diplomatic formula that bridges zero enrichment and sovereign enrichment right. They are mutually exclusive positions, and every attempt to find middle ground has failed. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has said Iran will not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment, directly contradicting what American officials claim Iran agreed to in the ceasefire framework. Iran's foreign ministry has said that uranium will under no circumstances be transferred anywhere, rejecting proposals for another country, such as Russia, to take Iran's enriched uranium. Axios has reported the U.S. may be willing to time limit the enrichment commitment to 20 years. Iran has countered with 5 years. Even if both sides could agree on a time frame, the verification mechanisms, the inspection protocols, and the enforcement provisions would take months to negotiate, months that neither side's military or economic position can afford. The Parliamentary National Security Committee has stated that Iran will not agree to extend the ceasefire if it does not include Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. That statement binds Iran's negotiators to a position that the United States has categorically rejected. Meanwhile, Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader whose constitutional authority encompasses command of the armed forces, the power to declare war and peace, and supervision of the direction of the state, remains invisible. More than 2 months after his appointment, no photograph, video, or audio recording has been released. His statements are read by others. AI-generated videos circulate on state media. Reports from sources close to his circle describe severe facial and leg injuries, multiple surgeries, and burns that make speech difficult. The International Crisis Group's Iran director assessed that Mojtaba is not in a state where he can actually make critical decisions or micromanage the talks. The system is using him to get final approval for key broad decisions, but not the tactics. Iran is being governed by a committee of military commanders, parliamentary leaders, and security officials operating in the shadow of an invisible supreme leader. And the question of who actually holds decision-making authority has become the single most consequential unknown in the entire conflict. The economic pressure on Iran is now approaching the threshold that Pezeshkian warned about. The IMF projects a 6.1% GDP contraction with 68.9% inflation. The rial has collapsed to a record low. The U.S. naval blockade has cost Iran $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue since April 13. 45 commercial vessels have been turned away. Storage at Karg Island is nearing capacity, and Iran may be forced to shut in oil wells, a process that risks permanent damage to reservoirs and could take years and billions of dollars to reverse. Infrastructure damage from the U.S.-Israeli strikes has been estimated between $200 and $270 billion. Senior economic officials have reportedly warned Pezeshkian that rebuilding could take more than a decade. Iran's central bank governor has urged the president to pursue a peace deal. The resistance economy that Tehran has championed for decades is being tested beyond anything its architects imagined. But the pressure on the United States is real and growing. American gas prices have reached $4.46 a gallon. Oil above $100 a barrel is feeding inflation that the Federal Reserve cannot ignore. The midterm congressional elections in November present a political deadline that constrains Trump's options. The War Powers Resolution typically requires presidents to seek formal congressional approval 60 days after beginning military action, and the administration has cited the April 8th ceasefire to argue that the clock has stopped, a legal position that Democrats are actively challenging. Secretary Rubio's declaration that the combat operation is over may itself be partly motivated by the need to neutralize war powers' pressure. Over 600 attacks were launched against U.S. facilities in Iraq during the active conflict phase. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia was struck by Iranian missiles and drones, damaging U.S. refueling aircraft and injuring 15 soldiers, including 5 critically. An Iranian Navy frigate was sunk by the submarine USS Charlotte in the Indian Ocean, the first submarine kill since the Falklands War. The costs, risks, and escalatory dynamics of this war are compounding with every day the ceasefire remains fragile. And then there is Lebanon. Iran has explicitly stated that talks with Washington cannot resume unless a ceasefire also holds in Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon in March to attack Hezbollah after the Iranian-backed group launched rockets in support of Tehran. A separate Lebanese ceasefire was arranged in mid-April, but fighting continued on a smaller scale. On May 4, Israel ordered thousands of Lebanese civilians to evacuate villages in southern Lebanon, an escalation that directly threatens the broader peace process. Ghalibaf, Iran's chief negotiator, has said that a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations are unreasonable as long as the Lebanon conflict continues. Every Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon is a nail in the coffin of the Iran negotiations. The two fronts are entangled in ways that neither side can unilaterally resolve. Trump himself acknowledged this when he said Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire deal and that Hezbollah would need to be dealt with separately. But for Iran, there is no separation. Lebanon is the war. Hormuz is the war. The nuclear program is the war. Everything is connected, and no single piece can be resolved without addressing the whole. Now let us look at what this critical phase means across the capitals that shape the outcome. In Beijing, Wang Yi's meeting with Arachi today is being read as a pre-summit positioning move ahead of Trump's May 14th visit. China wants stability in the Gulf. It wants tankers moving. It wants its oil supply restored. But it also wants to extract something from Washington on Taiwan in exchange for pressuring Iran. Wang Yi told Secretary Rubio on April 30th that the Taiwan issue concerns China's core interests and that the U.S. should keep its promises and make the right choices. The U.S. Treasury Secretary has urged China to join an international operation to open the strait. A Beijing think tank director previously told reporters that China lacks both the capability and inclination to pressure either side into negotiations. Beijing is playing mediator without committing to mediation, positioning itself as a responsible power before the Trump visit while limiting its own exposure. In Islamabad, Pakistan remains the indispensable broker. It was Pakistan that arranged the ceasefire. It is Pakistan that is preparing the next round of talks. It is Pakistan's army chief, Asim Munir, who enjoys the trust of both Washington and Tehran. And it is Pakistan's credibility with both sides that keeps the diplomatic channel open at a moment when every other channel has been exhausted or discredited. The Iranian ambassador to Pakistan called the talks at a critical, sensitive stage. That description is more accurate than any official statement from either belligerent. In Moscow, Russia remains on the sidelines, profiting from high oil prices and the distraction from Ukraine, while offering Iran nothing beyond diplomatic rhetoric and a vetoed UN resolution. Russia offered to trade its intelligence sharing with Iran for American intelligence support to Ukraine. Washington rejected the offer. The offer itself told Tehran everything it needed to know about where it sits in Moscow's priorities. In European capitals, the UK and France have hosted two conferences on reopening the strait and signed a 38-nation statement expressing readiness to ensure safe passage. But conferences and statements do not clear mines or escort tankers through waters where cruise missiles were fired at American ships yesterday. The war has reached the point where every actor is trapped by its own position. Iran cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz without appearing to capitulate to American military pressure, which would destroy the regime's credibility with the population it is simultaneously repressing and the hardline factions that control the instruments of state violence. 21,000 people were arrested during the 12-day war in June 2025. Over 500 more have been arrested since the current conflict began. Public executions of protesters detained during the January 2026 uprising are ongoing. The regime cannot show weakness abroad while crushing dissent at home. The United States cannot accept Iranian control of the strait without acknowledging that the most expensive military operation since Iraq failed to achieve its core objective. Trump cannot resume bombing without risking war powers challenges, higher oil prices, and voter backlash ahead of November. Iran cannot sustain its economy under the dual pressure of the blockade and wartime damage for much longer than the 3 to 4 weeks Pezeshkian warned about, a timeline that is already running out. The IRGC cannot accept nuclear concessions without undermining the ideological foundation of the revolution. And Mojtaba Khamenei cannot resolve any of these contradictions because he cannot appear in public, cannot speak to his nation, and may not be capable of the kind of decisive leadership that this moment requires. The Iranian foreign minister said that an agreement was just inches away, but criticized maximalist demands from U.S. negotiators. Inches away and infinitely distant are not contradictions in this war. They are the same thing. First, the ceasefire is not a ceasefire. It is a pause in kinetic operations maintained by mutual exhaustion and the absence of any better option. Ships are still being attacked. Vessels are still stranded. The strait is still contested. The blockade is still in force. The only thing that has stopped is the large-scale aerial bombardment, and even that cessation is being framed differently by each side. Second, the nuclear issue is the immovable obstacle. The United States demands zero enrichment. Iran says enrichment is non-negotiable. Iran's foreign ministry says uranium will not be transferred anywhere. The gap between these positions is not bridgeable by Pakistan or any other mediator without one side fundamentally reversing its stance, and neither side shows any indication of doing so. Third, the internal power struggle between Pezeshkian and the IRGC is the variable that could determine whether Iran accepts a deal or fights to the end. If the civilian government prevails, compromise becomes possible. If the IRGC prevails, the war resumes. And the invisible supreme leader who is supposed to arbitrate between these factions may not be physically capable of doing so. Fourth, the Trump-Xi summit on May 14th is the next inflection point. If Beijing agrees to pressure Iran on Hormuz in exchange for Taiwan-related concessions, the diplomatic equation shifts dramatically. If Beijing demurs, the stalemate continues. The war has not ended. The ceasefire has not held. The strait has not reopened. The negotiations have not produced an agreement. The supreme leader has not appeared. The economy has not stabilized. And the question that hangs over every capital, every military command, and every diplomatic back channel on earth is the same question it has been since February 28th. How does this end? Nobody knows. But the clock is running. The window is closing. And the world is about to find out what happens when two nations trapped by their own positions run out of time simultaneously. What do you think? Is a deal still possible, or has the war passed the point of no return? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, stay sharp.